The creatures that took my dog left behind 18-inch footprints and claw marks stretching nearly 8 feet up a tree. When they came for me and my horse on that final night, the way they worked together made one thing frighteningly clear. These mountains harbor something far more intelligent and far more dangerous than any wildlife manual ever dared describe. What I endured during 5 years of isolation in the Cascade Range changed everything I thought I knew about what lives in the darkest corners of our forests. My name is Jim Morris, and until recently, I lived completely alone in a remote cabin, 40 miles from the nearest neighbor. That solitude wasn't by accident. It was exactly what I needed after losing everything that had once defined my life. The divorce papers arrived one Tuesday morning in March, handed over by a court clerk who didn't bother to look me in the eye. Sarah took it all: the house, half the farm, and, most painfully, our daughter Emma. The custody agreement gave me visitation every other weekend, which felt like a cruel joke after 23 years of marriage. That night, I sat in the empty house soon to belong to someone else, working through a bottle of whiskey, staring at the walls that had once held decades of memories that were now about to be boxed up and split like property in a liquidation sale. By dawn, I'd made up my mind. I couldn't stay and watch my old life get dismantled piece by piece. I had to disappear, to find a place where the grief couldn't follow. The cabin belonged to Pete Jameson, the local feed store owner. His grandfather had built it deep in the Cascades back in the 1922nd, reachable only by an old logging road long since reclaimed by the forest. Pete told me the cabin was still solid, complete with a horse stable and a well that never ran dry. More importantly, it was 40 miles from the nearest town, far enough that the world might finally leave me alone. The deal took 3 weeks to finalize. I sold off everything I couldn't haul and packed my pickup with essentials: tools, medical supplies, enough canned food to feed a small army, ammunition, and books. My old quarter horse, a 15-year-old ranger's mount, came with me, along with Scout, my half-border collie. Both animals seemed to sense the finality of our departure as we left civilization behind. The last 40 miles took nearly 3 hours to navigate. What Pete generously called a road was little more than 2 ruts separated by weeds, winding through dense forest that seemed to close in behind us. When we finally broke into the clearing where the cabin stood, I understood why Pete's grandfather had chosen this place. The cabin was just as advertised, a sturdy log structure with a rusted tin roof. The stable clung to the hillside out back, its heavy timbers still strong despite decades of neglect. A small creek ran along the western edge of the clearing, offering fresh water and a gentle, steady song. But what struck me most was the silence when I killed the truck's engine. No cars, no machinery, no voices. That first night, stretched out on the narrow bunk, listening to Scout snoring by the fireplace and my horse shifting in the stable, I felt something I hadn't known in years: peace. Those early weeks tested every survival skill I'd learned growing up on the farm. The wood stove demanded constant attention. I had to memorize the quirks of the hand pump to draw water from the well and figure out why the stable door wouldn't shut properly. But each small victory brought a satisfaction no contract signing or boardroom meeting ever had. Slowly, I built routines that gave shape to my long, quiet days. Mornings always came first, feeding and watering Ranger, checking his hooves and coat, and mucking out the stall. Scout needed less care, but far more exercise. So every morning we spent an hour walking the perimeter of the clearing. Afternoons were for maintenance and repairs. The cabin's bones were good, but decades of neglect had taken their toll. I replaced missing chinking between the logs, tightened loose floorboards, and fitted sturdier latches to the shutters. Evenings were reserved for books and planning. I had brought along a small library, survival manuals, wildlife identification guides, medical references, and novels to keep my mind occupied through the long winter nights. By lantern light, I read and filled the journal I'd started keeping, recording everything from weather patterns to animal behavior. My first trip back into town came 3 weeks after I settled in, when my coffee supply ran dangerously low. I saddled Ranger for the long ride down the mountain, Scout trotting beside us as we pushed through the overgrown logging road. Cedar Falls was exactly what you'd expect from a place with only 800 residents, one main street with the essentials, surrounded by modest homes and a handful of light industrial buildings. At Murphy's General Store, I stocked up on coffee, salt, sugar, and other staples I couldn't produce myself. The clerk, a middle-aged woman named Helen, looked curious about the stranger buying in bulk, but said little beyond warning me about the bears coming out of hibernation. Summer arrived slowly. bringing longer days and a beauty that made isolation feel more like a gift than a sentence. Wildflowers flooded the clearing, fireweed, lupine, and beargrass, painting the ground in colors that shifted week by week. I carved out a small garden behind the cabin, clearing enough brush to let in sunlight for vegetables. The soil was rich with decades of rotted leaves, and the seeds sprang up eagerly. What had once felt overwhelming now grew comfortable, then precious. Weeks would pass without seeing another person, and I found myself forgetting conversations I once thought mattered. Out here, success was measured in simpler terms. Had I split enough wood to last the winter? Was Ranger healthy and content? Could I fix the loose plank on the stable wall before it got worse? Scout adapted to the new life with the eager energy of a dog bred for outdoor work. He took it upon himself to guard the clearing, patrolling the tree line each morning and evening with fierce focus. Ranger took longer to adjust, having been used to other horses and steady work on the farm. But over time, he too settled into our quiet rhythm, seeming to find contentment in the peaceful cadence of our isolated life. My monthly trips into town became a kind of social ritual. Helen at the general store always had news to share, and I came to look forward to those brief conversations. They were glimpses into the world I'd left behind without the pain of having to fully rejoin it. That first winter came early, snow arriving in October and hanging on until March. Isolation became complete. The logging road lay buried beneath feet of snow, cutting off any chance of getting to town. I had prepared well, stockpiled food and firewood, but nothing could fully brace me for the sheer brutality of mountain cold. It was harsh, but manageable with planning. I insulated the cabin walls with old blankets and newspaper, turning it into a snug refuge as long as the fire kept burning. Scout reveled in the snow like a puppy, even though he was nearly 8 years old. The forced solitude gave me time to think, really think, for the first time in years. Spring returned like a rebirth. As the snow melted and the first wildflowers poked through, I realized I hadn't just survived my first winter, I had, in some strange way, thrived. That pattern repeated, with variations, for the next 4 years. Each season carried its own trials and rewards. I learned to read the weather by watching the clouds and the wind. I became skilled at preserving food, smoking fish from the creek, drying berries and wild onions, and storing vegetables in the cool cellar I dug beneath the cabin. That fourth winter tested me harder than the previous 3 combined. A late November blizzard dumped 6 feet of snow in just 48 hours. Then the temperature plunged so sharply that even breathing outside felt like swallowing knives. Ranger developed a cough that worried me for days before it finally cleared. Scout got into a territorial fight with a fox and came back with a torn ear that needed careful cleaning and bandaging, but we weathered it. And when spring finally broke, the sense of satisfaction ran deeper than any business success I had ever known. I had kept my little family alive through the worst nature could throw at us, relying only on preparation, grit, and the skills I'd honed over 4 years of trial and error. As the 5th year began, I felt a kind of stability I'd never experienced before. The cabin had truly become mine after hundreds of small repairs and adjustments. The garden produced enough vegetables to last through winter. I had mapped every trail and landmark within a day's ride, carving out a private wilderness that felt as familiar as the farm I grew up on. The pain of my old life had dulled to a lingering ache, surfacing only in quiet moments. I still thought of Emma, and always would, but the grief that once drove me into these mountains had settled into something manageable. I had learned to live with loss, to find meaning in small victories, to measure success by standards that had nothing to do with anyone else's approval. Helen mentioned that a few hunters had passed through, spinning wild tales about a strange shelter they'd found near Dead Man's Creek. Not a hunting camp, but something else, branches and sticks woven together like a giant bird's nest, large enough for a person to sleep in. They claimed they'd also found tracks around it, unlike anything they'd ever seen. The prints looked human, they said, but enormous, bigger than snowshoes, and sunk so deep it had to come from something weighing twice as much as any man. I rode home with Helen's words stuck in my head. Dead Man's Creek was only 10 miles from my cabin, squarely within the territory I thought I knew. In all my years exploring these mountains, I had never found anything like what those hunters described. Maybe it was time to look again. I planned a 3-day camping trip to scout the area thoroughly. The ride in took nearly the entire first day, following trails through timber so dense the sunlight barely touched the ground. I set camp on a flat bench above the water, where Ranger could drink easily and Scout could roam without losing his bearings. On the second day, I worked my way upstream, leading Ranger and letting Scout run free ahead. The forest here felt different than around my cabin, older, anchored by massive trees that must have been standing since the first loggers pushed into these mountains a century ago. The silence was deeper too, broken only by the creek's murmur and the occasional crack of a branch under Ranger's hooves. Scout found it first. About an hour into the trek, his bark rang out, not the warning bark he gave when chasing squirrels, but something sharper, more urgent. I tied Ranger to a sturdy pine and pushed toward the sound, weaving through downed timber and thick brush. The structure stood in a small clearing about 50 yards off the creek, and the sight of it froze me in place. It was exactly as Helen had described, a dome-shaped shelter woven from branches, coated with moss and leaves, but massive, easily big enough for a man my size to stand upright inside, nearly 8 feet across. What unsettled me wasn't just the size, but the craftsmanship. The branches weren't tossed together like a fallen lean-to. They were carefully selected, bent, and interlaced with a precision that made the whole thing both functional and eerily artistic. Whatever had built this wasn't just surviving, it was thinking. It had patience and skill beyond anything in the animal kingdom I'd ever encountered. Scout circled the shelter, growling low, hackles raised in a way I'd never seen before. I called him back and stepped closer, my hand resting on the rifle slung over my shoulder. The entrance faced away from the creek, little more than a low opening you'd have to crawl through. I dropped to one knee and peered inside. The interior was dim, shadowed, hard to make out. A smell drifted out, not quite familiar. Musky, wild, but tinged with something I couldn't place. I stepped back and circled the structure, looking for more clues. That's when I found the tracks. They were exactly as the hunters had described, human-like but enormous, pressed deep into the soft soil around the shelter. I pulled out my tape measure and recorded them carefully. The prints stretched 18 inches long and 8 inches wide, with a distinct arch like a massive human foot. Whatever had made them had to stand at least 8 feet tall, maybe taller. I spent an hour photographing the area from every angle, then cast the clearest tracks in plaster. All the while, Scout stuck close to my leg, unusually silent, his head constantly turning as he glanced back into the forest. When I finally led Ranger out of the clearing, the sensation of being watched was overwhelming. It wasn't the fleeting paranoia you sometimes feel when alone in the wild. It was a focused intensity that made the hair on my arms stand straight up. That night, camped beside the creek, the unease never left me. Scout refused to settle, pacing circles around our little camp, pausing to stare into the darkness with his ears pricked. Ranger shifted restlessly in the makeshift corral, snorting and stamping every time the wind stirred the branches. I built the fire larger than usual and kept it burning through the night, dozing in my sleeping bag with the rifle at my side. Several times I woke to noises that might have been branches creaking in the wind or something heavier moving just beyond the firelight. Back at the cabin, I developed the photos and studied them obsessively. The structure was far too complex for any known animal. But what kind of intelligence could have built it? For a time, I considered the possibility of another hermit, someone even more reclusive than me. But the tracks ruled that out. No human foot could be that large, and the depth of the impressions suggested a weight no man could carry. Over the following weeks, I found myself scanning the forest more carefully during my daily routines, watching for broken branches, disturbed ground, any hint I wasn't as alone as I thought. I found nothing. But that did little to ease the sense that something had changed. The first direct sign came on a moonless night in early November. I was reading by lamplight when Scout suddenly lifted his head from his spot by the fire, ears pricked in that border collie way. A moment later, he rose and pawed gently at the door, nose pressed to the crack at the bottom. I set my book aside and listened. At first, nothing, just the familiar sounds of the forest. Then a low, warbling call carried through the night, less like a bird song and more like a vibration of unease. I moved to the window and carefully pulled back the curtain. The clearing outside lay empty, glazed with frost under a faint starlight. Ranger was quiet in the stable, oddly calm for times when predators usually passed nearby. But Scout's body was rigid, eyes fixed on the door. And then I saw it. Movement at the edge of the clearing, near the eastern tree line. Something massive and dark stood upright among the pines. It lingered only a moment, barely visible in the dim light, then melted back into the forest as silently as a shadow. I grabbed the rifle and flashlight, eased the door open, and swept the beam across the trees. Nothing. Scout slipped past me, nose to the ground, and charged to the spot where I'd seen it move, sniffing furiously. The next morning, I found the prints, those same massive tracks I'd photographed at Dead Man's Creek, pressed deep into the soft earth at the edge of the woods. Whatever had made them had stood there for some time, watching my cabin in the dark. That discovery should have terrified me. Instead, it left me with a strange blend of fear and exhilaration. After 5 years of solitude, something else was sharing this mountain with me, something utterly unlike anything science was willing to admit existed. I was staring at proof of a creature that wasn't supposed to exist, and I was its only witness. In the weeks that followed, the visits continued always at night, always just a flicker of movement at the edge of vision. Scout grew more agitated with each encounter. He paced and whined, but never barked the way he would at ordinary wildlife. Ranger seemed less affected, though every so often he'd lift his head and stare into the trees as if listening to sounds I couldn't hear. I started keeping a detailed log: dates, times, weather conditions, and animal behavior. The photos I took showed the same 18-inch footprints, but with subtle variations that suggested more than one individual. Sometimes the tracks completely circled the cabin, as if whoever made them was conducting a thorough reconnaissance. Other times, they came within a few yards of the walls before retreating into the forest. The visits grew more frequent and increasingly deliberate. At first, they came only on moonless nights, when visibility was worst. But over time, they grew bolder, edging closer even in brighter conditions. Eventually, I began finding evidence of them during the day. Branches snapped at heights no bear could reach, stones arranged in strange patterns along the creek where none had been before. The most disturbing discovery was the sudden appearance of crude shelters like the one I'd found at Dead Man's Creek sprouting all around my cabin. Within a month, I counted 7 of them within a mile, each positioned with a clear line of sight to my clearing. They were built with the same intricate weaving I'd seen before, but the newer structures showed refinement. Air vents near the ground, drainage channels to divert rain, angled tunnel entrances to block direct lines of sight. It was no longer random. Something or someone wasn't just watching me. They were building a permanent surveillance grid around my home. The psychological pressure was crushing. Every movement outside felt observed, every routine dissected by an invisible intelligence. I started changing my daily schedule at random, feeding Ranger at different hours, chopping wood at odd times, taking Scout on new routes as if unpredictability could throw them off. But the shelters never stopped multiplying, and the watchers never stopped watching. The worst signs were the ones that proved they'd been right at the cabin while I slept. I found enormous handprints pressed into the soil around the foundation, as though testing the structure's strength. One morning, I noticed stones from my chimney had been carefully removed and replaced in a slightly different pattern. The message was unmistakable. We can go anywhere we want, even here. Soon after, food began disappearing from my outdoor stores, not the random scavenging of ordinary wildlife, but selective theft. They took only the smoked meat and dried fruit, leaving vegetables and grains untouched. The containers weren't broken into. They were opened and resealed with surgical precision, items removed as if for study. It felt less like theft and more like sampling an investigation into my diet and methods of food storage. The creek, once my steady backdrop of peace, became a constant source of unease. I found tracks pressed into the muddy banks, odd stacks of river stones balanced into impossible towers, fish populations in my usual spots dwindling as though something with a far greater need was harvesting them. As the pressure mounted, the Scout's behavior grew darker. The once bold dog that patrolled our perimeter now refused to venture more than 20 feet from the cabin after nightfall. By day, he would bark suddenly at empty woods, only to fall silent mid-bark, as if silenced by an unseen command. His appetite faded, and signs of severe stress set in panting heavily, pacing endlessly, restless to the point where he could hardly sleep. Ranger's reactions were equally troubling, though different. Horses are naturally sensitive to changes in air pressure and wildlife activity, but now he displayed behaviors I'd never witnessed before. Ranger would sometimes stand frozen in his stall for hours, ears locked forward, listening to sounds beyond my hearing. When I approached him during those moments, he would shy away, as if my presence interrupted some important exchange I wasn't privy to. More troubling still, I began to hear sounds from the forest noises that defied classification. They weren't growls or roars like those of large predators, but something closer to language, Patterns of clicks, whistles, and low-frequency hums carried for miles through the mountain air. The calls always came from multiple directions at once, suggesting a dispersed network of communication, keeping contact across long distances. They happened most often during shifts in the weather, as if the creatures were coordinating their movements according to atmospheric conditions I couldn't perceive. One night, I listened to a full hour of what could only be described as a symphony layers of calls echoing across the woods, groups answering one another in what sounded like a rehearsed conversation. I recorded what I could with an old cassette deck, but the tape captured only fragments of what I heard. As October bled into November, the psychological pressure mounted to unbearable levels. I woke often in the middle of the night to see massive shadows sliding across my windows, blotting out the stars as giant figures drifted past the cabin. They moved too smoothly, too deliberately to be random wildlife, and their sheer size suggested beings far larger than anything science recognized. On one especially terrifying night, I counted at least 8 distinct shadows circling the cabin for hours. They moved with mechanical precision, rotating clockwise around the building, each keeping an equal distance from the next, pausing at intervals as if performing a ritual. The coordination required for such behavior spoke of a social organization far beyond any wild predator I had ever imagined. Soon, they began leaving offerings near my door. Not random forest debris, but carefully chosen items arranged in deliberate patterns. Weathered deer antlers, bleached silver with age, perfectly rounded stones no river could have shaped, bundles of fragrant herbs bound with twisted grass, and most disturbing of all, small wooden carvings in crude human form. The figures haunted me. They showed not only the use of tools but also artistic expression. Carved from soft wood with what must have been sharpened stone, they displayed fine motor control and an eerie sense of portraiture, each bearing unique features rather than generic forms. I began to suspect these were part of a complex social ritual, perhaps an attempt at communication or gift exchange. Yet accepting them felt dangerous, like entering into a relationship with beings whose motives were utterly unknowable. I left the offerings untouched, and by morning they would vanish, replaced by new arrangements, each more elaborate than the last. The psychological strain peaked when I realized the creatures were manipulating my environment in ways designed to unhinge my mind. Trees that had stood solid for decades appeared overnight twisted into impossible spirals. Stones I used as trail markers were rearranged into disorienting geometric stacks. The forest trails themselves began to change in subtle ways. A fallen log shifted a few feet to the left. A massive boulder rolled into a path that had been clear the day before. The landscape was almost the same, but never exactly familiar and alien at once. The message couldn't have been clearer. They controlled this land. My presence here continued only at their discretion. Everything I thought I knew about my mountain home could be altered without warning. The psychological toll was devastating. I began to doubt my own memory and perception, wondering whether the forest had always been different than I recalled. Sleep became nearly impossible as activity around the cabin intensified. Night after night, I lay awake, listening to footsteps circling the cabin, heavy breathing just outside the walls, and what sounded like whispered conversations in a language I couldn't understand. The creatures had learned to exploit my most basic human need for rest, choosing those vulnerable hours to stage their most disturbing displays. By late November, I was surviving on little more than coffee and pure adrenaline, rarely sleeping more than 3 hours a night. My hands shook constantly, my vision blurred with exhaustion, and I found myself jumping at shadows, even in broad daylight, the hours that were supposed to bring peace. The isolation that had once been my salvation had become a prison, guarded by watchmen growing bolder and more hostile with every passing night. These creatures, and by now I was certain there were many of them, had countless chances to storm the cabin if they wanted to harm me. Instead, they seemed content to watch, their curiosity mirroring mine, though theirs felt increasingly predatory, like a cat toying with its prey before the kill. The balance shifted on a late November night, when the first major storm of winter swept into the mountains. Snow had been falling for hours, heavy, wet flakes that clung to everything and muffled all sound. I spent the evening feeding Ranger, making sure he had enough hay and water to ride out the blizzard comfortably. Scout, however, was restless the entire day, managing only brief snatches of uneasy sleep. As the wind picked up and began driving snow against the cabin windows, his agitation escalated. He paced from the door to the window and back again, pausing as if listening to something only he could hear. Around midnight, He began to bark, not his usual warning bark for wildlife, nor the excited bark of greeting, but something else entirely. It was a sound I had never heard from him before. Deep, urgent, almost frenzied. He stood at the door, hackles bristling, eyes locked on something I couldn't see. I grabbed the rifle and flashlight, but hesitated before opening the door. The storm was howling now, strong enough to topple trees, and the snow so thick I could barely see across the clearing. Whatever had provoked, Scout was out there in the chaos. His barking grew more frenzied, and then he began clawing at the door, desperate to get outside. In 5 years together, I had never seen him so determined to leave my side. Something was terribly wrong. I switched on the flashlight and cracked the door just wide enough to peer out. The beam cut only 10 feet into the swirling snow, but it was enough. The clearing wasn't empty. Shapes moved between the cabin and the tree line. Not one or two, half a dozen, maybe more. Before I could react, Scout bolted through the gap, vanishing into the storm with one last bark. I shouted his name, but the wind swallowed my voice. Within seconds, his barking faded, then disappeared altogether. I stood in the doorway, scanning the storm with my flashlight for what felt like hours, but was only minutes. The shapes I thought I saw were gone if they had ever been there at all. The blizzard was so violent I couldn't trust my eyes, every gust turning trees and snow into shifting phantoms. But one thing was certain, Scout was gone. I waited until dawn, praying I would hear his familiar bark or see him trot back, shaken but alive. When the snow finally eased and pale sunlight touched the clearing, I wrapped myself in blankets and set out to track him. His paw prints were easy to follow across the fresh snow. They led straight from the cabin to the eastern tree line, and they weren't alone. Massive footprints, the same ones I had cataloged for weeks, flanked his tracks. But these were different, more numerous, deeper, heavier than any I had ever seen before. I followed them into the forest, rifle raised, eyes straining for movement. The trail wound through thick brush, over fallen logs, across boulders slick with ice. Even in good weather, the terrain would have been brutal. The prints continued for half a mile before stopping abruptly. There I found Scout's collar, dangling from a broken branch 8 feet off the ground. The leather strap was frayed and torn, as if ripped away with tremendous force. Beneath it, the snow was churned up and stained with what looked like blood, though not much. Nearby, deep claw marks scored the bark of several trees, long parallel slashes, too high and too deep for any bear. I searched for another hour, calling his name, combing every sign I could find. Nothing. No body, no trail, nothing but that collar and those haunting claw marks. When I finally staggered back to the cabin, fear hit me harder than it ever had in all my years in the mountains. The watchers had made their decision. Observation alone was no longer enough. They had taken Scout, whether for food, as a warning, or for some purpose I couldn't imagine. Back at the cabin, I was left in a cruel dilemma. Ranger was still safe in the stall, but his behavior told me everything I needed to know. He pawed at the ground, eyes rolling white whenever I approached. Horses sensed danger better than most, and he knew something was very wrong. I needed to get to town, to report Scout missing and maybe seek help from the authorities. But that meant leaving the cabin, hitching Ranger to the sled, and traveling 40 miles of mountain road in winter conditions. In normal circumstances, it would have been risky, but manageable. Now, with these creatures watching every move, it felt like suicide. I chose to wait until morning, hoping daylight might make the journey safer and give me time to plan carefully. I spent the entire day reinforcing the cabin, double-checking locks, boarding windows, clearing, firing lanes in every direction. But by evening, when I went to ready Ranger for travel, escape was no longer an option. The horse that had carried me faithfully for 5 years refused to leave the stall. No coaxing, no pulling, no pushing would get him across the threshold. His eyes rolled wide, muscles trembling, as though stepping outside would mean stepping into his death. Ranger knew something I had only begun to understand. We weren't just being watched anymore. We were being hunted by something with intelligence, patience, and power beyond anything the wild was supposed to hold. And tonight, they were coming. That night, they came. I lay on my bunk with the rifle across my chest, ears straining for any unusual sound. The first came as a heavy, deliberate footstep. Not the snap of a twig or the rustle of brush, but the unmistakable tread of something massive crossing the clearing. Then another. Then more from several directions at once. They were circling the cabin, moving with coordinated rhythm that betrayed thought and calculation. I counted at least 6 distinct sets of steps, maybe more. Then the first blow hit. Not a knock, not the scrape of an animal testing new ground, but a full, deliberate strike against the cabin wall, strong enough to rattle the frame. A second blow followed, then a third, as if several of them were testing the structure's limits all at once. Sliding from the bunk, I crept to the front window, rifle in hand. Through a narrow gap in the boards I had nailed across the glass, I caught glimpses of shapes moving under the stars. Towering figures, larger than anything that should exist in these mountains. One of them stopped just short of the door, easily 8 feet tall, covered in black hair. As I watched, it raised a massive fist and slammed it against the wall again. The sound was immediately echoed by blows from the other sides of the cabin. They weren't just surrounding me. They were communicating, coordinating the assault. From the stable came a noise that froze the blood in my veins. Ranger screaming in terror. I heard him kick the stall walls, panicked beyond control, while something outside struck the stable siding hard enough to make it shudder. At that moment, I made a decision that might have saved both our lives. Staying inside the cabin and hoping the walls would hold was no longer an option. I grabbed my rifle, stuffed extra rounds into my pocket, and bolted for the back door. The stable was only 30 yards away, but crossing that clearing felt like a mile. I slammed the heavy beam across the stable door just as something outside struck the wall with bone-jarring force. Through the cracks between the boards, I could see them moving silhouettes shifting in the dark. Not one or two, many. They were everywhere, surrounding the stable. Ranger thrashed wildly, rearing and kicking so hard I thought he might cripple himself. I pressed myself against his flank, speaking to him, stroking his trembling neck, trying to calm him. His eyes rolled white, muscles twitching with sheer panic. The first strike against the stable door nearly knocked me off my feet. No matter how strong the beam was, it didn't stand a chance against that kind of power. Each strike rattled the timbers, the heavy bar groaning under the pressure. A second blow followed, then a third, each one harder than the last. Between impacts, I could hear them moving outside, testing different points of weakness, shifting their weight from wall to wall. The sounds they made were unlike anything I had ever heard. Guttural growls, clacking noises, and what could only be fragments of language. I took up a position with a clear line on the door and raised the rifle. If they broke through, I'd have maybe 1 or 2 shots before they reached me. Against creatures this large and this strong, I wasn't sure even a clean hit would be enough. The pounding on the door grew more furious, the rhythm of multiple attackers taking turns. Each blow shook the structure so hard I could feel the floorboards trembling under my boots. The beam began to splinter. It wouldn't hold much longer. That's when I opened fire. I aimed at the points where the noise was loudest, hoping to hit something vital through the thin log walls. The rifle cracked deafeningly inside the confined space, and Ranger's panic surged with each shot. But the plan worked. The pounding stopped. I racked the bolt and fired again and again, cycling the rifle as fast as I could. Through the muzzle flash, I caught fleeting glimpses of massive silhouettes pulling back into the trees. Their retreat thundered through the ground as heavy footfalls shook the frozen earth. Within seconds, the assault was over. The stable fell silent, except for Ranger's frantic breathing and the pounding of my own heart. I waited, rifle leveled, braced for a second wave, but none came. Whatever I'd hit or whatever they had felt from those bullets was enough to convince them the cost of pressing forward was too high. Dawn crept in slowly, and I spent the early morning listening, waiting for any sign they were still nearby. When I finally worked up the courage to unlatch the stable door and peer outside, the clearing was empty. But the evidence was undeniable. Deep gouges carved into the wooden walls, massive footprints stamped into the snow, and dark stains blood, maybe where some of my shots had landed. I knew I couldn't stay. These things had shifted from watching to attacking, and the next time might come in broad daylight. My only hope was to get out before they regrouped. It took 3 hours of coaxing before Ranger would leave the stall. He was traumatized, trembling, but his trust in me finally outweighed his terror. I loaded only the essentials: food, water, ammunition, the photographs, and the plaster casts of their prints. The ride down was the longest 40 miles of my life. Every shadow could have hidden one of them. Every gust of wind in the pines could have been footsteps. But somehow, we made it to town without another encounter, and I never looked back. I sold the cabin to the first buyer who'd take it sight unseen for less than half of what I'd paid. I never told them about the creatures that had driven me out. Why would I? They'd think I'd lost my mind. Maybe I had. 5 years of isolation can do strange things to a man. But the evidence is real. The photographs, the plaster casts, the scars on Scout's collar. They all sit in a box in my small apartment now, reminders that something impossible lived in those mountains alongside me, something that tolerated my presence until it didn't. Even now, late at night, when the wind rattles the windows, I wonder, are they still up there, roaming the forests that swallowed my life for 5 long years? Did they reclaim the cabin, make it their own? And do they remember the strange intruder who dared to share their mountain until fear finally drove him back to civilization? More than anything, I wonder if Scout is still out there running with something not quite wolf, not quite man, but something older and far stranger than either. The mountains are good at keeping their secrets, but sometimes those secrets strike back when disturbed. I learned that lesson the hard way, and I will never forget it. Never forget the sound of massive footsteps circling my home in the dark, or the calculating intelligence behind the final coordinated assault that drove me from the Cascades. There are creatures living in the deepest forests of our world that science refuses to acknowledge, creatures no map dares to mark. I know because I lived among them for 5 years, and I survived to tell the story. Whether anyone chooses to believe it, that's another matter entirely. But the Pacific Northwest is not the only place that hides these things. Evidence continues to mount piece by piece. Now take a look at this photographic proof from the next encounter in the wild.